I was inducted beneath lights that flickered with the irregular patience of a dying heart. The lumen strips buzzed overhead, casting everything in a jaundiced pallor that made skin look already embalmed. I stood on a yellow line painted decades ago and never refreshed, its edges worn thin by boots like mine. The adept sat behind a desk that had once been ornate and was now merely functional, its carvings filled with dust and wax drippings. His eyes never met mine. They stayed fixed on the parchment, on the columns and sub-columns that mattered more than my breathing. When he asked my name, it was only so he could strike it out and replace it with a string of numerals that followed me from that moment onward. I remember the sound of his quill more than his voice, a dry, scratching whisper, like an insect burrowing into old wood. Each stroke felt like a cut, shallow but cumulative. I pressed my thumb into an ink pad and stamped where I was told, the ink cold and slick against my skin. There was no oath spoken aloud, only a printed affirmation that service was eternal and complaints would be registered posthumously. I signed because the line demanded a signature, and because refusal had been engineered out of the process long before I arrived. When it was done, the adept rang a bell, not to mark completion, but to summon the next body. I was already obsolete. They moved us in groups through the ship's lower intake docks, past warning sigils and purity seals layered so thick they peeled like scabs. The void ship did not welcome us, it consumed us. Each checkpoint was a narrowing throat, each pressure door sealing with a hiss that sounded too much like satisfaction. Armed ratings checked our papers without reading them, trusting the stamps more than the men attached to them. The air changed with every compartment, growing drier, thinner, laced with recycled breath and machine exhaust. By the time we reached the habitation decks, my tongue felt swollen and my head rang with a dull, persistent ache. My assigned bunk was numbered, not named, bolted into a wall that vibrated constantly. The metal was warm, as if the ship's heat had soaked into it over centuries and never let go. When I lay down, the mattress exhaled the sour breath of previous occupants, sweat, fear, a faint trace of disinfectant that had long since lost the battle. Men lay above and below me in stacked coffins, coughing, muttering prayers, or staring at nothing. No one spoke in full sentences. Words were rationed like water, used only when necessary and never wasted on hope. I learned quickly that sleep came in fragments. The ship never truly rested, it only shifted its labors. Somewhere deep in its hull, engines throbbed with a rhythm that never quite settled, a heartbeat slightly out of time. Each tremor ran through the deck and into my bones, making it impossible to forget where I was. When I closed my eyes, the darkness pressed back, heavy and intimate. Dreams came unbidden, of endless corridors lined with filing cabinets, of hands stamping forms until the flesh wore away and bone clicked against inked metal. The first time I noticed the prayers echoing too long, I blamed exhaustion. I whispered the litany of endurance under my breath, as required before sleep, and listened as the words bounced down the corridor and returned to me half a second late. The delay was subtle, just enough to make my skin prickle. Sound behaved strangely aboard the vessel, stretching and compressing in ways the training manuals never mentioned. Footsteps sometimes arrived before the men who made them. Laughter lingered after mouths had closed. I told myself it was acoustics, bad design. The normal decay of a ship older than any of us. Days, or what passed for days, were marked by work rotations and ration chimes. I hauled crates stamped with sigils I was not cleared to interpret, scrubbed coolant residue from grates, and logged maintenance checks I did not understand. Supervisors barked orders from behind rebreather masks, their voices flattened and impersonal. Every task came with a form, every form with a duplicate, every duplicate with a penalty for errors that were never explained. The bureaucracy was a second hull around us, thicker than ceramite, impervious to reason. It did not care if you were tired or sick. It cared only that the boxes were filled. There were moments, brief and treacherous, when I almost felt pride. When a supervisor nodded once at a correctly completed log. When my ration was not downgraded for a clerical infraction. These small mercies were the hooks that kept us compliant. I clung to them, ashamed of how much they meant. At night, I counted them like relics, proof that I still existed as something other than a resource, yet beneath it all, the ship felt wrong. Not hostile, not yet, just attentive. The decks shivered when no machinery was active. Bulkheads creaked as if adjusting themselves. Once, while leaning against a wall during a brief rest period, I felt a vibration that did not match the engine cycle, a faint tremor that traveled upward instead of down. I pulled my hand away quickly, heart racing, and pretended it was nothing. To acknowledge unease was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was never merciful. I wrote my first personal entry that cycle, scratching words onto a scrap of requisition parchment I had salvaged. I told myself it was to maintain sanity, to keep a record in case something went wrong. In truth, it was an act of quiet defiance, a way to assert that I was more than a line item. I hid the paper inside my boot, close to the skin, where the warmth might preserve it. Even then, a part of me knew how futile it was. The Imperium archives everything, but it remembers nothing. When I think back on those early days, I am almost grateful for their mundanity. The cruelty was familiar, predictable, wrapped in procedure and precedent. It allowed the illusion that survival was possible if I followed the rules closely enough. I did not yet understand that the rules themselves were a kind of hunger, and that the ship had already begun to feed. The order for mandatory attendance arrived as a strip of thin paper thrust into my hands by a scowling petty functionary. As impersonal as a ration chit and twice as sacred, it bore the ship's seal, an embossed sigil pressed so deep it cracked the fibers, and beneath it a phrase printed in harsh block script: PIARSINBDE and BIOGO FFECRCASIFICITUM REQUIRAT. There was a blank line for my number, already filled in by someone I would never meet, and a square box stamped in red to indicate compliance would be observed. We did not ask questions. Questions were an indulgence reserved for those who had the luxury of answers. We moved when commanded, because the ship's routines were a chain of gears. If one tooth refused to turn, something would grind and scream and punish the nearest flesh. The procession to the shrine deck began at the end of a work rotation, when our bodies were already heavy with fatigue, and the recycled air tasted of rust and sweat. A corridor chief herded us out with a shock prod that snapped blue arcs in the gloom. The prod never touched anyone, its crackle was enough. The sound made my teeth itch. We filed in lines of 4, boots clanged on grating, my hands still stank of solvent from scrub duty, and the odor clung to my nails no matter how hard I rubbed them. Above us, pipes ran like veins along the ceiling, sweating condensation that dripped in slow, cold beads. It ran down the back of my neck and pooled at my collarbone. I kept my eyes down, as instructed, because the ship's internal picked sensors were always watching, and wandering gaze had been added to the list of minor infractions the last time someone disappeared after a patrol. As we approached the shrine, deck access, the architecture changed in subtle ways that made my stomach tighten. The utilitarian plating gave way to surfaces that had once been polished, now dulled by time and soot. I saw carved reliefs of saints and martyrs in the bulkheads, faces worn almost featureless by centuries of passing hands. Purity seals layered the door like scales, parchment tags stamped with wax that had gone brittle and cracked. Each seal carried prayers in cramped script, words I could not read but had been taught to fear. At the threshold, a pair of servitors stood sentinel. They were not the ones you saw in work bays, those blunt instruments of labor. These were ecclesiastic models, their heads shrouded in hooded cloth, their faces replaced by brass masks shaped into fixed expressions of devotion. Incense burners were fused to their forearms, smoke curling from vents that pulsed in time with their mechanical breathing. As we passed, one turned its head with a slow, grinding precision and extended a hand. In its palm lay a strip of paper. I took it automatically. It was a prayer docket. The docket had my number printed at the top, and beneath it a short litany to be recited at designated intervals. There was even a place to mark completion, tiny squares to be filled with ink, like a checklist of faith. I stared at it for a moment, my mind snagging on the absurdity. Even devotion, here, required documentation. Inside, the shrine deck was colder than the corridors behind it, but the air was thick, heavy with layered scents. Wax, old dust, machine lubricant, and underneath it all, a sharp, metallic tang that made the inside of my nose sting ozone, like the air before a storm in the lower hive levels, like a power conduit arsing somewhere nearby. It did not belong in a chapel. It made my skin crawl. The space was vast, built to dwarf the human form into submission. Rows of benches, more like reinforced rails, were bolted to the deck. We were directed into them like ammunition into a magazine. Far ahead, the altar rose in tiers, a brutal mass of riveted steel and gilded iconography. A massive aquila loomed above it, its wings spread wide, feathers rendered in razor-edged metal. Candles burned in their hundreds, their flames trembling as if in fear of something unseen. Their light fought a losing battle against the darkness gathered in the rafters. I remember the sound of the ship here more than anywhere else. The engines were muted, as if the chapel walls had been designed to muffle the mundane. In their place, other noises emerged, the faint click of cog, teeth somewhere behind the altar, The whisper of servo motors, the soft rasp of cloth as penitence shifted. Every cough sounded like a confession. Every breath felt like a sin. A priest stood at the front, but priest was an insufficient word for what he was. He wore layered robes stiff with embroidered scripture, and a rebreather mask molded into the shape of a serene human face. Tubes ran from his collar into the floor, feeding him air that tasted purer than ours. His hands were gloved, and when he gestured it was with a deliberate, practiced economy, as if even movement required authorization. He began to speak, and I understood then what my outline had only hinted at. His words were not meant to inspire. They were requisitioned phrases, liturgical blocks recited because they were required by doctrine. He delivered them the way an adept reads a manifest, each syllable clipped, each pause placed with bureaucratic precision. There was no warmth in his tone, no comfort, only obligation. We responded on cue. The prayer docket told us when to speak, and an enforcer, lector, paced the aisles, listening for lagging voices. When someone stumbled over a line, the lector struck them with a baton, not hard enough to kill, only hard enough to remind. The crack of impact echoed through the chapel like punctuation. Servitors moved among us in perfect patterns, swinging censers in wide arcs. Their chains clinked softly, a hypnotic rhythm. The smoke that poured from the censers was not the sweet incense I remembered from the hive's public shrines. It was bitter and metallic, mixed with something chemical that burned the throat. It coated my tongue and left a taste like copper filings. My eyes watered, but I did not wipe them. To wipe your face during benediction was to suggest discomfort, and discomfort suggested weakness. I tried to focus on the Aquila above the altar, on its cold, unblinking authority. I tried to make my mind small and obedient, as I had been trained, but the ozone smell kept intruding, sharp and insistent. I could feel it on my gums, like the aftertaste of lightning. The hair on my arms stood up, prickling beneath my sleeve. Somewhere in the deep structure of the ship, power was being drawn and redirected in quantities I could not comprehend. The benediction continued for what might have been an hour or a lifetime. Time in the chapel was strange. The air was thick enough to slow thought. My eyelids drooped from exhaustion, and each time my head began to nod, I snapped awake, terrified of being noticed. I watched men around me, some with eyes closed, mouthing the words like automatons, others staring forward with hollow, resigned faces. We were not a congregation. We were cargo being blessed before shipment. Then it happened. The first sign was a subtle shift, a change in the vibration underfoot. I had grown accustomed to the ship's constant tremor, that ever-present reminder of machinery and void. But this was different. It was deeper, heavier, like a giant hand pressing against the hull from the outside. The benches trembled, wax dripped faster from the candles, thick rivulets running down their sides as if the heat had suddenly increased. The priest's voice did not falter. If he noticed, he gave no sign. He continued his requisitioned litany, eyes fixed on a point above our heads. The servitors kept swinging their censers. The lector kept pacing, baton ready. It was the Imperium's way. If the world changes beneath you, you do not react until a stamped order tells you that reaction is permitted. And then the ship's great engines began to sing. I do not have a better word for it. The sound was not merely mechanical noise. It was a note, low, resonant, impossibly vast, that rose from beneath the deck and filled the chapel like a tide. It vibrated through my ribs, through my teeth, through the soft tissue behind my eyes. My stomach rolled. A few men retched quietly into their hands. The lector struck one of them for breaking posture. The note deepened, layered with harmonics that made the air feel thick and alive. It crawled up my bones and turned my muscles to trembling wire. It was not pain, exactly. It was the sensation of being tuned, like an instrument tightened until it might snap. In that humming, singing vibration, I heard something else. At first I thought it was my own heartbeat, amplified by fear. But it was too steady, too deliberate. Beneath the engine's song, under the priest's relentless recitation, there was a second rhythm. Tap, tap, faint, distant but unmistakable, like knuckles on steel, like claws testing a door. My throat tightened. The ozone smell sharpened until it felt like it was slicing the inside of my nose. The candle's flames leaned all at once, as if a wind had passed through the sealed chapel. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, their faces remained rigid, trapped behind the mask of compliance. The tapping continued. It did not match the engines. It did not match the servitor sensors. It was its own cadence, patient and curious. It sounded like it came from behind the walls, from inside the metal itself. The ship, that vast iron beast, suddenly felt thin. Like skin over something immense and hungry, I clenched the prayer docket in my fist until the paper crumpled. the edges cutting into my palm. I recited the next line automatically, voice blending with the others, because to stop would be to draw attention. But inside, something cold uncoiled. The realization, sudden and sickening, that we were not simply traveling. We were being taken somewhere. The priest reached the final portion of the benediction, his tone unchanged, his hands raised in a gesture, and looked less like blessing and more like formal declaration. The lector moved down the rows, stamping our dockets one by one with an inked seal to mark attendance. When his stamp hit my paper, the sound was loud in my ears, final, official. The engine's song swelled, the tapping became a scrape, and as we were dismissed in orderly lines, as if nothing had occurred, I felt the ship shiver in a way that did not belong to machinery at all. It felt like anticipation. By the time I returned to my bunk, the taste of ozone still clung to my tongue. I lay in my coffin of steel and listened to the ship's deeper heartbeat, and underneath it, the faintest, most intimate sound of something on the other side of reality, testing, waiting, learning. The blast doors came down without ceremony. There was no warning klaxon this time, no polite Vox announcement pretending control still existed. One moment the junction ahead of me was open, its hazard stripes worn dull by centuries of boots. The next, it was sealed by a slab of reinforced plasteel that slammed into place with bone, rattling finality. The impact reverberated through the deck, a physical punctuation mark. A line had been drawn, and I was on whatever side the Imperium had decided was acceptable to lose. A moment later, the purity wards ignited. I felt them before I saw them, a pressure in the air, a faint electric prickle across my skin like the onset of fever. Runes etched into the bulkheads flared a dull white, their light unsteady, as if struggling to remember the shapes they were meant to form. Some flickered and went dark almost immediately. Others held, casting warped shadows that bent at angles my eyes resisted following. The smell of ozone intensified, layered now with burned dust and old incense dragged from shrine reserves and hastily redeployed. A Vox speaker crackled overhead, its grill vibrating as if something inside wanted out. Section designation Delta, 7 through Delta, 9 is now under quarantine protocol. The voice intoned. It was not the same calm adept from before. This one sounded tired, strained like a man reciting orders while reading his own death warrant. Remain within sealed areas. Unauthorized movement will be interpreted as contamination response failure. Contamination. The word settled over us like ash. Men gathered instinctively, drawn together by fear despite years of conditioning that told us isolation was safer. I recognized some faces from work rotations, gaunt, grease-streaked, eyes bright with a terror that had nowhere to go. One man sobbed openly, rocking back and forth, his hands clamped over his ears as if he could block out the ship itself. Another muttered prayers under his breath so fast the words blurred into a hiss. Then the ration chutes activated. With a clatter of mechanisms, narrow slots opened in the walls and spat out sealed packets onto the deck. Each one was stamped with a date, a section code, and a bold designation, QRISSUE. Minimal sustemis, water chits followed, thin and light, each marked with a serial number that would be tracked against our ident tags. Even now, the logistics systems functioned. The Imperium might lose a ship, but it would not lose count. Along with the rations came another item, sliding from a separate slot with almost reverent slowness, confession chits. They were small sheets of foil paper, dull gray and unpleasantly warm to the touch, as if they had been stored too close to a reactor or an altar flame. At the top of each was our number, already printed. Beneath it, a list of transgressions in cramped text, each with an empty box beside it. Heresy of thought, doctrinal doubt, unclean perception, unauthorized sensory experience. Failure of faith under duress. At the bottom was a blank space for additional confessions, and below that, a line for a signature. I stared at mine for a long time. Around me, men reacted in different ways. Some dropped to their knees immediately, scratching at the foil with shaking styluses, eager to unburden themselves of anything that might damn them further. Others laughed, sharp and hysterical, crumpling the chits in their fists. One man tore his in half and stuffed the pieces into his mouth, chewing furiously until an enforcer noticed and beat him unconscious with the butt of a shock maul. Yes, enforcers. They emerged from behind a secondary blast door, 4 of them in heavy flak armor, faces hidden behind visors etched with purity sigils. Their presence was abrupt, absolute. Shotguns rested casually in their hands, muzzles angled down but ready. The lead enforcer raised a hand, and the noise in the compartment died almost instantly. "Confession is mandatory," he said. His voice was amplified, stripped of any trace of humanity by the helm's Vox grill. Failure to comply will be recorded as willful spiritual contamination. Someone, braver or more desperate than the rest, shouted, "What's happening to the ship?" The enforcer did not answer immediately. He turned his visor slowly toward the voice, letting the silence stretch. When he finally spoke, it was to someone else. "Step forward," he ordered. The man who had shouted hesitated for half a second too long. That was enough. The shotgun barked once, deafening in the enclosed space. The blast took the man in the chest, throwing him backward in a spray of blood and torn fabric. He hit the deck hard and did not move. The smell of burned propellant mixed with copper and ozone, thick enough to taste. The enforcer lowered the weapon. "Unverified rumors compromise morale," he said flatly. "Morale compromise is a vector for contamination." Two others dragged the body away with practiced efficiency, leaving a dark smear on the deck. A servo skull descended from the ceiling, lenses whirring as it recorded the scene. A moment later, a small printer slot opened and spat out a strip of parchment, which one enforcer picked up and affixed to the corpse with a wax seal. "Material Westi Presidi." I felt something inside me go hollow. The doors remained sealed. Time lost meaning. The red emergency lighting never changed, bathing everything in a perpetual state of alarm. Sweat accumulated, turning sour in the stagnant air. The smell of fear became a constant presence, heavier than any incense. Every cough sounded loud. Every whispered word felt like a risk, and through the walls, I heard it, laughter. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as hysteria, a man breaking under pressure, mind snapping like overstressed metal, but it did not come from any identifiable mouth. It echoed strangely, too close and too far at the same time, slipping through bulkheads and decks without using corridors or vents. It was intimate laughter, soft and knowing, as if shared between friends in confidence. It did not sound human. The enforcers pretended not to hear it. They paced their routes, boots thudding in steady patterns, weapons always visible. Their discipline was absolute, but I saw it in the way their heads turned just a fraction too slowly, the way their grips tightened when the laughter swelled and faded. They were afraid too. They were just better trained to be afraid correctly. I took my confession chit and sat against the wall, knees drawn up, stylus trembling in my hand. For a long time I did not write. The boxes stared back at me accusatory. What counted as doctrinal doubt was fear itself heresy. Did noticing the wrongness of the ship constitute unclean perception? Eventually, I began to fill it out. I confessed to every impure thought I could remember. Every moment of resentment towards supervisors, every flicker of doubt during prayer. I wrote about the tapping I had heard in the chapel, the breathing in the corridors, my terror during the gravity failure. My stylus dug deep, scoring the foil until my hand ached, not because I believed it would save me, but because I wanted the record to show that I had obeyed, that I had tried. As I wrote, the laughter grew closer, sliding along the inside of my skull. Words on the chit seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, boxes appearing where there had been none before. I blinked hard, forcing my vision to steady. Hallucinations were a known symptom of stress. The manuals said so. The manuals had answers for everything, if you looked hard enough and ignored what contradicted them. When I finished, I signed my number at the bottom with a shaking hand and pressed my thumb into the provided ink strip. The ink felt warm, too warm, and for a moment I thought it pulsed beneath my skin. An enforcer came by later, collecting the chits. He did not read them. He simply scanned the serials and dropped them into a sealed container marked with ecclesiastical sigils. My confession joined hundreds of others, indistinguishable. A mass of fear reduced to paperwork. As the hours dragged on, the laughter never fully went away. Sometimes it was joined by whispers, too faint to make out words, but heavy with implication. Once I thought I heard my own voice among them, speaking softly, reassuringly, telling me that the forms were sufficient, that obedience would be rewarded. I pressed my hands over my ears and prayed harder. The Imperium had done what it always did when faced with the unknown. It had sealed it off, categorized it, and demanded documentation. We were no longer crewmen. We were a quarantined resource, a spiritual liability to be managed. And as the ship groaned and shuddered around us, as something pressed and laughed just beyond the wards, I understood with sickening clarity that this was only the beginning. They opened the doors because the paperwork demanded movement. Not because it was safe, not because the ship had stabilized, but because the rotation schedule, stamped and countersigned somewhere far above our heads, indicated that labor resources in quarantine had reached maximum idle tolerance. The Imperium does not allow stillness. Stillness breeds thought, and thought breeds heresy. So the blast door shuddered, groaned, and finally retracted, revealing corridors that smelled wrong even before we stepped into them. A supervisor addressed us through a hand vox, his voice thin and distorted. He stood well back from the threshold, flanked by enforcers and a pair of servo skulls that hovered like bloated flies. "Controlled labor rotation," he announced. "You will proceed along the designated route, perform assigned maintenance, and return within the allotted time window. Deviations will be recorded. Failure to return will be recorded. No mention of rescue, no mention of the warp, just recording." We were issued chalk sticks stamped with shrine approval marks, blessed chalk, if such a thing could exist. The supervisor held one up for us to see. "You will mark your path," he said. "Approved runes only. This is a navigation anomaly, nothing more. Follow procedure." Navigation anomaly. The phrase tasted bitter. I had heard it before, whispered in training vids and casualty reports, always followed by redacted sections and casualty numbers that did not add up. But I nodded with the rest. We all did. To refuse was unthinkable. To comply was familiar. The corridor beyond the doors looked ordinary enough at first glance. Same riveted walls, same exposed cabling, same flickering emergency lights casting everything in red and shadow. But as soon as my boot crossed the threshold, I felt it, that subtle wrongness, like stepping onto a deck plate that was half a centimeter out of alignment. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat broke out along my spine. We moved in a line, chalk in hand, marking arrows and runes on the walls as instructed. The chalk squeaked softly against the metal, leaving pale symbols that stood out starkly against the grime. Each mark was a small act of defiance against the confusion, a claim staked in dust and ritual. I clung to them, counting steps, reciting the litany of orientation under my breath. The air grew warmer the farther we went. Not the dry, mechanical heat of engines or conduits, but a humid warmth that beaded moisture on my skin. Condensation formed on the bulkheads, trickling down in slow, viscous lines. It smelled faintly sweet, cloying, like spoiled incense mixed with rot. I wiped my hand along the wall and brought my fingers to my lips without thinking. The taste made me gag. It was wrong. Too rich, like something organic pretending to be holy. "Keep moving," the supervisor barked through the vox. His voice echoed strangely, arriving a heartbeat later than it should have. "Mark every junction." We did. We marked doors, corners, maintenance hatches. Each chalk rune a reassurance that we were progressing, that distance meant something. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, on the scrape of chalk, on the sound of breathing inside my own skull. Anything to drown out the faint, ever-present laughter that had begun to seep back into the air, soft and distant. After what felt like 10 minutes, after my calves burned and my breath came short, we reached a familiar sight. The prayer-stained hatch. I stopped so abruptly the man behind me nearly collided with my back. The hatch was unmistakable, a dented pressure door with a faded Aquila stenciled across it, surrounded by dozens of scratched prayers and tally marks left by crewmen over decades. I had passed it countless times during routine patrols. It marked the boundary between habitation and auxiliary storage. It should not have been here. I looked down. My own chalk mark stared back at me from the wall beside the hatch, fresh, unsmudged, still faintly dusty. The arrows pointed forward, toward the path we had just walked. "No," someone whispered. "No, that's not." "Quiet." The supervisor snapped, though his voice shook. "Reorient. Check your markings." We did, desperately. Men pressed hands to walls, tracing chalk lines, counting symbols. Everything was correct. Every rune was one we had placed ourselves. There was no break, no missing segment. The corridor had looped seamlessly, folding in on itself like a bureaucratic trick, returning us to our starting point without ever turning. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, hysterical, sharp. I swallowed it down, bile burning my esophagus. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. "Navigation anomaly," the supervisor repeated louder now, as if volume could enforce reality. "Proceed again. Mark redundantly." Redundantly. We went back the way we had come, marking over our previous marks, thickening the lines until the symbols blurred together. The walls felt warmer now, almost feverish. When I leaned close to draw a rune, I could swear the metal yielded slightly under pressure, like flesh pressed too hard. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart racing. The laughter grew louder. It was not mocking. That was the worst part. It sounded pleased, curious, as if something was delighted by our efforts, amused by our insistence on rules and markings. Again, after minutes that stretched into something shapeless and exhausting, we arrived at the same hatch. One man broke then. He dropped his chalk and ran, screaming incoherently, boots slapping against the deck as he fled down a side passage that should have led to an auxiliary bay. I watched him go, frozen, unable to look away. The passage bent, not dramatically, not enough to justify panic. It simply curved at an angle that made my eyes ache, the far end narrowing like a throat swallowing him whole. His scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, dragging sound that made my skin crawl. The supervisor's vox hissed with static. "Do not pursue," he ordered. "Subject is non-compliant." Non-compliant, as if that explained anything. "Enough," one of the older crewmen said hoarsely. He had been quiet until now, eyes sunken, face gray. "This isn't a corridor. It's a servo." Skull drifted closer, lenses wearing. The supervisor raised his hand. The man stopped speaking, jaw clenching shut. We all knew better than to finish sentences like that. The chalk marks began to smear, not all at once, subtly, as if the walls were sweating them away. Lines blurred, symbols sagged, arrows lost their direction. The blessed chalk dissolved into pale streaks that ran downward, dripping like melting wax. It was as if the ship disliked being labeled, resented our attempt to impose order on it. I felt something shift inside me then, a cold realization settling like a lead weight. This was not a malfunction to be corrected. This was not a deviation to be logged and resolved. The vessel was no longer ours. It was still shaped like a ship. It still obeyed some of its old rules, gravity, atmosphere, corridors, but those rules were now suggestions, enforced only when convenient. Something else had its attention now, something that found our procedures quaint and our fear entertaining. The supervisor's voice came again, barely audible through the vox. "Return to quarantine," he said. "All personnel return immediately." We did not question it. We turned as one and walked back the way we believed we had come, guided by instinct more than markings. The corridor mercifully did not loop again. Or perhaps it did, and simply chose a different destination. When the quarantine doors finally sealed behind us once more, the relief was so intense it left me shaking. Men collapsed where they stood, sobbing openly now. No enforcers struck them. No one bothered. The laughter faded to a distant murmur, as if satisfied for the moment. I sat against the wall, chalk dust coating my hands, and stared at the smears on my palms. The taste of sweetness still lingered on my tongue, sickening and inescapable. In my mind, over and over, a single thought repeated with bureaucratic clarity: "We are being kept." The muster order arrived printed on emergency vellum, the kind reserved for hull breaches and mass casualties. Its edges were already curling from the heat when it was passed hand to hand through the quarantine section, stamped so many times the ink bled into itself. "A la belle persona el repio RFR en ayusion respius." Beneath it, in smaller text, was a list of equipment allocations and procedural reminders, each one absurdly precise. The Imperium, confronted with the impossible, had reached for its favorite weapon procedure. They gathered us in a reinforced cargo bay that had once held crates of munitions. Now it held us instead, thin, shaking, eyes too bright. Officers stood on a raised platform, flanked by flickering lumen globes and the ever-present servo skulls, their lenses tracking us with mechanical indifference. The officers' uniforms were immaculate despite everything, pressed and sealed. Purity seals pinned at regulation angles. Their faces were drawn tight, mouths set in lines that suggested they were reciting prayers internally to keep from screaming. "We are facing a localized incursion," the ranking officer announced. He read from a data slate, eyes never leaving the scrolling text. "The nature of the intrusion is classified. You are not required to understand it. You are required to respond." Shock mauls were issued first, their grips worn smooth by generations of hands. Then fire, suppression foam canisters, heavy and awkward, labeled with warnings about improper deployment. Finally, printed instruction sheets, laminated, blessed, and stamped, detailing su enter intresio rispos pluco os razor nenning. I stared at mine, at the diagrams of corridors and silhouettes, marked hestil presensi, and felt a hollow laugh rise in my chest. This was not a war. Wars had enemies you could see, lines you could draw. This was a clerical error made flesh. We formed up in squads assigned by availability, not aptitude. No one asked if we had combat experience. The administratum had determined that bodies were required, and bodies were what it would get. An officer walked down the line, inspecting us like defective machinery. When he reached me, his gaze lingered on my bruised shoulder and the tremor in my hands. "Functional," he said, and moved on. As we advanced into the ship's deeper sections, the air grew colder, sharper. Frost formed along the edges of bulkheads, delicate patterns that resembled script if you stared too long. The engine's song was gone now, replaced by an uneven thrum that pulsed like a wounded heart. Every step echoed too loudly, sound snapping back at us from angles that made no sense. That was when I saw the shadow. It belonged to the man ahead of me, a thin, stooped figure clutching his shock maul with white-knuckled intensity. His shadow stretched long across the deck, cast by a lumen strip behind us. At first, it behaved as expected, mimicking his movements with obedient precision. Then it hesitated. The man took a step forward. His shadow did not. It lingered, clinging to the deck for a fraction of a second too long, before sliding ahead in a smooth, liquid motion that did not match his stride. I slowed, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the dark shape. The shadow detached completely. It peeled away from his feet like spilled ink, flattening and stretching until it no longer resembled anything human. It glided ahead of him, hugging the deck, flowing around obstacles without effort. The man stopped walking. His head tilted, as if listening. "Stay in formation," the squad leader hissed. The man did not respond. He took another step, then another, following the shadow as it slid toward a ventilation grate set low in the wall. His movements were slow, dreamlike, utterly calm. When the shadow reached the grate, it poured through the slats and vanished. The man followed. He knelt, pressed his face close to the metal, and smiled. Then he shoved his arm into the grate. We shouted. Someone grabbed for him, fingers slipping on frost-slick armor. He did not scream as the metal bent impossibly, widening to accept him. He simply crawled forward, shoulders dislocating with wet pops, ribs compressing as if his body had forgotten its own limits. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by darkness and steel. The grate snapped back into place. The officer behind us marked something on his data slate. "Subject compromised," he said. "Proceed, proceed." We did. The first breach did not look like a breach. There was no explosion, no tearing metal. The air ahead of us rippled, like heat haze over a manufacturing floor, except it burned cold to look at. Frost spread outward from the distortion, racing along the deck and walls. My breath came out in white clouds, each exhale painfully sharp. The instruction sheet fluttered in my shaking hands. "Engagi estel presiendacia apio piradi farci." There was no guidance for what we were seeing, because it had never been meant to exist. The distortion widened, and something pushed through. I cannot describe it properly. My mind slides away when I try, filling the gaps with noise and pain. It was a shape made of absence, edges defined by the way reality recoiled from it. Where it touched the deck, metal blackened and peeled, curling back like burned paper. The air screamed without sound. "Charge." The officer ordered. We charged because the order was stamped and sealed, because obedience was the only survival the Imperium had ever taught me. Shock malls crackled as they struck nothing, arcs of blue energy vanishing into the distortion. Fire, suppression foam hissed uselessly, freezing and shattering before it could coat anything solid. Something brushed past me. Not a blow, not a touch, more like the suggestion of contact. A pressure inside my skull, a whisper of sensation that made my vision blur. For a moment, I smelled my childhood home recycled air, boiled protein, the comforting hum of distant machinery. Then it was gone, replaced by screaming static and the copper taste of fear. Men fell. Some were flung aside by forces I could not see. Others simply collapsed, eyes rolling back, blood seeping from noses and ears. One officer drew his sidearm and fired until the weapon overheated and fused to his gauntlet, his face locked in a rictus of determination that never wavered even as something unfolded his body like parchment. Through it all, orders continued to come. Retreat, advance, regroup. The Vox net was a tangle of overlapping commands, each one authoritative, each one obsolete the moment it was spoken. Bureaucracy fought the impossible with checklists and stamps, and lost ground with every breath. At some point, I realized we were not pushing the intrusion back, we were feeding it. Every death, every scream, every flash of terror seemed to make the air heavier, the distortion more eager. The laughter returned, louder now, layered with other sounds, murmured prayers spoken backwards, voices that wore familiar tones like borrowed clothing. When the retreat order finally came, it was almost a relief. We fell back in disarray, dragging the wounded, abandoning the dead where they lay. The corridors behind us sealed one by one, blast doors slamming down to isolate the spread. Each closure felt less like defense and more like a sacrifice. Sections of the ship cut away and offered up to buy a few more minutes. As we stumbled back toward quarantine, I looked at my hands and realized they were shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear alone, but from something else, a resonance, a lingering echo of contact. I could still feel the pressure behind my eyes, the whisper of something that had noticed me. I understood then that this was not an invasion to be repelled. It was an audit, and we were failing. I am writing this by the light of a single emergency lumen, its casing cracked, its glow pulsing weakly as if uncertain it should continue. The air in this compartment is thick with burnt wiring and the sweet, rotting scent of things that should not exist inside a sealed hull. Every breath coats my tongue. My chest aches, not from injury alone, but from the effort of continuing to draw air that feels increasingly optional. The compartment was once an administrative relay office. I can tell by the furniture bolted to the deck, desks with data, ports long since fused shut, cabinets labeled in faded script, drawers full of blank parchment that never got used. The irony is not lost on me. Even now, surrounded by the remnants of bureaucracy, I am compelled to document, to confess, to leave something that can be filed. The command staff is gone. I do not know when it happened. There was no announcement, no final address over the Vox. They simply ceased to exist as a coordinating force. Some were executed earlier, purged for compromised judgment, when their orders conflicted too openly with reality. Others vanished during inspection, stepping through doors that never led where they should have. A few, I am told, locked themselves in sanctums and tried to pray the ship back into obedience. The ship did not answer them kindly. What remains of command is paper. Orders still print from wall slots at regular intervals, parchment sliding out with mechanical devotion. They repeat themselves now, looping endlessly. Men INTA and PUCTO. Sheduia HOFA ASHIAU FITUEN. Each sheet demands signatures from officers who are no longer attached to arms, from adepts whose bodies have been repurposed or worse. Servo skulls dutifully collect the unsigned orders and file them away, their logic engines unable, or unwilling, to accept the absence of hands. Outside the viewport, one of the few still intact, there is no starfield. At first I thought the glass had clouded, scorched by radiation or warped by stress. But when I wiped it clean with my sleeve, the truth pressed back against me. There is only a bruised infinity beyond the hull, colors bleeding into each other without pattern or distance. It does not move like space, it watches, patient, attentive. Like a clerk waiting for a stamp to come down on the page, I have seen things in the last cycles, if cycles still apply, that have stripped away whatever illusions I clung to. Men unfolded into shapes that fit better between worlds. Icons that bled light and whispered promises of understanding, corridors that breathed. But the most merciless truth has been quieter, more mundane. The Imperium will not mourn us. It will file us. I know this because I found the draft casualty ledger. It was stored in a data vault that had somehow remained untouched, its seals intact, its cogitators humming faithfully. The ledger had already been updated, entries scrolling past with relentless efficiency. Section by section, name by name, or rather, number by number. My section was there. My number was there. STUS, ALOS THMED XPNDD, a neat line, a definitive conclusion, no space for ambiguity. I laughed when I saw it. A dry, broken sound that echoed too loudly in the vault. Expended. As if I were ammunition fired into the dark and forgotten. As if that were the end of it. But there was another column, Raso URC Papio UNDRVW. That is what terrifies me most, because I understand now what this place is to the Imperium. Not a disaster, not a tragedy, but an opportunity wrapped in acceptable losses. If the ship returns, and something tells me it will, one way or another, it will not return empty. It will return changed, catalogued, studied. Anything still alive will be assessed not for survival, but for usefulness. I have seen what usefulness looks like. I passed a processing bay earlier, where men were strapped into frames, their bodies pierced with interfaces they had not consented to. Adepts worked silently, grafting augmetics, rewriting nervous systems, murmuring prayers that sounded more like instructions. These were not wounded men being saved. They were components being adapted. One of them looked at me as I passed. His mouth moved, trying to speak, but all that came out was a burst of static and a single word, looped and broken. Useful. I fled before they could notice me. Now I sit here, back against a desk, writing on parchment that may never be read by human eyes. My hands are steadier than they should be. That frightens me too. Somewhere along the way, fear has burned itself out, replaced by a dull, administrative calm. The same calm I heard in the Vox voices at the beginning. The calm of inevitability. I can hear the ship around me, not groaning now, but murmuring content. The laughter has softened into something almost affectionate. I feel it pressing at the edges of my thoughts, reviewing me, assessing my compliance, my endurance, my thorough documentation. I want to believe that this confession matters. That somewhere, some archivist will read it and know that I tried to remain faithful. That I obeyed. That I did not embrace what was offered, even when it whispered my memories back to me in my own voice. But honesty compels me to admit the final truth. A part of me wants it to end, not in oblivion, but in definition. To be stamped, sealed, assigned a purpose so I no longer have to decide anything. To be folded into the machinery of this place and made simple. That is the most dangerous thought of all. If this document survives, let it stand as proof that I was still myself at the moment of writing. That I recognized the horror not only of the warp beyond the hull, but of the Imperium within it, the system that will not save us, only sort us. The lumen flickers again. I can hear footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the soft whine of servos. Perhaps they have come for me. Perhaps they have always been on their way. I will leave this here, unsigned. Let them decide what to do with me. After all, I have already been declared missing, and in the Imperium of man, nothing that is missing is ever truly wasted.